Welcome to the podcast today, book nerds. Today we're going to be talking to author Justin Newland about his book, The Old Dragon's Head. And before we get started with the interview, here's a quick synopsis. Constructed of stone and packed earth, the Great Wall of 10,000 Li protects China's northern borders from the threat of Mongol incursion. The wall is also home to a supernatural beast, the Old Dragon. The Old Dragon's Head is the most easterly point of the wall where it finally meets the sea. In every era, a dragon master is born. Endowed with the powers of heaven, only he can summon the old dragon so long as he possesses the dragon pearl. It's the year 1400, and neither the old dragon, the dragon pearl, nor the dragon master has been seen for 20 years. Bolin, a young man working on the old dragon's head, suffers visions of ghosts. Folk believe he has yin-yang eyes and other paranormal gifts. When Bolin's fief lord, the Prince of Yan, rebels against his nephew, the Jianwen Emperor, a bitter war of succession ensues in which the Mongols hold the balance of power. While the victor might win the battle on Earth, China's dragon throne can only be earned with the mandate from heaven and the support of the old dragon. Bolin embarks on a journey of self-discovery, mirroring old China's endeavor to come of age. When Bolin accepts his destiny as a dragon master, heaven sends a third coming of age for humanity itself. But are any of them ready for what's rising in the east? Alright, book nerds, welcome to the podcast today. I'm joined by Justin Newland. He's going to be talking to us about some of his works, and specifically his book, The Old Dragon's Head. So, super excited to get to talk to you about this. Justin, welcome onto the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you, Narry, and thank you so much for having me on the bookcast.
Absolutely. We appreciate you joining us for the interview. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your stories and your works?
Got a degree in maths in my student days. I've done a lot of IT and computers. I've used punch cards and all sorts of things. So I've seen the whole evolution of computers right up to today. I've worked in hotels, I've run small businesses, and for the last 15 years, well, during that time, I've done a lot of research in history, read a lot of literature, loved reading, still do, and had an eclectic interest in all sorts of odd and curious things in life, philosophy, history, drama, a bit of the esoteric, navigation, all sorts of things. I guess I'm just curious. So, and then my writing, I got writing about 15 years ago. Decided it'd be good to put some of that passion into my own words. My first book was called The Genes of Isis. That's set in ancient Egypt. And in short, retells the biblical story of the flood. I could maybe on a different podcast we could go into the detail of that. But The Old Dragon's Head, which we're going to talk about today, was my second novel, and it's historical fiction. And my third one was The Coronation, which is set in Eastern Europe in the 1760s, which was the time of the 7 Years' War, the time of what was called the Great Enlightenment, and the time when the steam engine was invented. I'm interested in turning moments in history, and that was one of them, which began a revolution which we all live in the wake of, if you like, the Industrial Revolution. And my fourth novel is a kind of pure novel. It's called The Abdication, and neither Coronation or Abdication are about kings and queens. The Abdication is a novel about a young woman's journey of self-discovery, and it's kind of loosely set in the Middle East. So that's where we are. And I think I mentioned to you early on, I'm currently drafting a novel about Elizabethan England. So it's another historical novel.
Definitely. And from what I understand, most of your novels are standalone, so they don't run kind of concurrently into each of the separate stories. But
when you're writing, do you ever kind of reference like your previous characters from the stories, or you ever hide any Easter eggs or anything like that?
Well, I guess the more I've gone on, the more of reference I've actually got to have. So I don't really make a point of it. And yes, they are all standalone. Having said that, the novel I set out to write on Elizabeth in England has turned into 2 novels because it got too damn long. So I had to cut it in half. And one novel is about the circumnavigation of the globe by Francis Drake. And the second part of the novel is really covering the repulse of the Spanish Armada. So, but in answer to your other question, I don't really reference other characters in the other books, but you never know.
Gotcha. So, Justin, tell us a little bit about your writing style and what kind of like a day in your life or a week or so, or however long it takes you to write, and kind of give us a little look into your creative process. What's that like?
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about that in the early part, Narry, weren't we? I was saying that certainly for me, and I guess it must be the same for other writers, the sort of sacred art that we strive for is be shut away in a room somewhere, permanently or semi-permanently, because what you want, particularly writing the last part of a novel, because that's when you need to hold the whole of the threads of the plot in your head. You want continuity. You want no distraction. So I guess I might try and configure my day like I did today, do the bits and pieces I had to do, and then head off to the writing place and manage to get 4 hours work done or redrafting the last chapter of the work in progress. So yeah.
Thanks. So that being said, wanting to kind of treasure that continuity and, like you said, kind of being locked away and being able to just kind of work on the novel, do you find writing to be something that's like kind of physically like demanding and draining on you, or do you feel energized when you're writing? You could just keep going on and on.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I've mused a lot on the question, what is writing? Because I've never seen anybody try and answer that question. Have you?
Yes, I
I
have.
mean, other than it's what appears when you write on a page, but what is the process? What's actually going on when you write, through your brain, through your semi-conscious, unconscious, or whatever. But that's maybe another podcast. But it's a fascinating process. Sometimes I feel energized, but yeah, sometimes I do feel drained. And I think it depends, well, it must depend on what you connect to. I mean, sometimes I might be moved to tears. That's happened before when I've written a scene and I start not crying, but I've moved to, my eyes get moist because of the emotion of the moment, I suppose. So that other times it might make you laugh. I suppose the writer is the first reader of his own works.
Absolutely. I mean, I can definitely agree with what you said, where you're the first one to read it. You're the first one to kind of see it all come into fruition and kind of imagine the characters and just kind of see them running throughout whatever story or journey that they're moving towards. So it's really almost like having a baby and taking care of it and kind of watching it grow.
I imagine it is. And I think that's a good analogy because you don't own the baby. The baby's there to be cared for, but it's not yours in the sense of you don't own it. It's come through you, from you, just like the words of a book. I mean, I try not to have possession on the words. And certainly one of my catchphrases for my writing and for a lot of my life is, you're only as, like a fisherman is only as good as his last catch. In the sense that, where you are with your life and where I am with my writing is my best effort is whatever I've just written.
And then kind of going off of that point, like where you're writing a lot of historical novels, but they're mixed kind of between fantasy and fiction, but also these turning points in history. I know you mentioned a little bit earlier off camera before we had started the interview that, you have like these different works of art that you tend to kind of look for so that you can kind of reference it. How much research do you usually have to do when it comes to these stories? Or is it something that you've kind of pulled from your mind and from past, like, kind of history lessons and things that you've had in the past?
Yeah, a bit of both, Narry, a bit of both. Certainly the first two novels, in fact, the first three, all came about because I had already researched and done. I'd even visited Egypt. I'd visited this place called Königsberg, which is now Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea, which was the setting for the coronation. But I hadn't been to China. So I had been to these places, researched them in my younger years, and researched the history of those times, of East Prussia for the coronation. Certainly, like a lot of people, just, enduringly fascinated by ancient Egypt. It's certainly my best-selling book because some people just see the cover and buy the book. And the second one is The Old Dragon's Head, because a lot of people, surprisingly, have been to China and walked the Great Wall, and have fond memories of that. So the research I would have done for The Old Dragon's Head, the China novel, I mean, I like to go to primary sources, as I imagine a lot of writers do. I have a whole concern about modern historians, bless their cotton socks, and even that includes myself, because you see, the trouble is these modern historians, they weren't there. And I was listening to actually a little podcast that I'd done a few months ago about Titus Josephus Flavius. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. You probably never have.
Sounds very familiar, but can't say I know a whole lot.
Well, young Titus Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian, okay, born around 37 AD, I think in Galilee or in Palestine, somewhere around there. And he got commissioned by the Romans, who were invading the area at the time, to write the history of the time, which of course featured the Romans, because they were the, as they say, the victors write the history. Having said that, I've got the book up on my shelf here, and there's about 700 pages that Titus Flavius Josephus wrote about the history of the time. Now, my point is that a certain other man lived at the same time, almost in the same area as Titus Flavius Josephus. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. Okay. So you would expect, given the impact that said Jesus has had on the world and the way it thinks and its moralities and philosophies and so on, and practices, to be virtually filled with references to Jesus the Christ. But no, there are 2 paragraphs out of 700 pages. Okay. So fast forward to any time in history, if you like, and I mean, this is a guy writing about his own time. He's not writing history. Do you see what I'm saying? And this is the problem that historians have, because they can only see what they can see according to their mental arrangement. So Titus Flavius Josephus, a mental arrangement, only allowed him to see what the Romans wanted him to see, because he was writing for them. You get a Marxist writing history about the Roman Empire, and what's he going to write about? He's going to write about the methods of production. He's going to write about slavery. He's going to write about the rights of, employment rights. Do you see what I'm saying? That's the lens. So a historian is only going to see, even today, even the best ones, because he's only referencing what other people have written, he's only going to see what his mental his mental arrangement allows him to see. And that is what? 1%, 2% of what actually happened, and the way it happened, and why it happened. And there are the three key questions. What happened, where it happened, and why it happened. And certainly the last question is what grabs me the most, is to try to understand, or at least appreciate. I think it's difficult because, say, for example, you want to, you got me going here, Narry. You realise that you have to shut me up in a minute. You appreciate that if you want to understand ancient Egypt, you have to think like an ancient Egyptian. Otherwise, how can you understand? We can't. That kind of summarises exactly what I've just been saying. But who can think like an ancient Egyptian? We can't. It's very, very, very difficult without living in the way they lived. But even then, how do we do that? So the best you can hope for is to try and appreciate the way they lived and the way they thought. And that applies to any period of history. Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Definitely. I think it's probably one of the most insightful answers I've ever gotten to that question in any interview. I will say that. And of course, seeing something through the lens, like you mentioned, you're not going to see something, or I guess the easiest analogy in modern day terms would kind of be like walking a mile in somebody else's shoes, trying to imagine what it would be like to see things through somebody else's perspective.
Brilliant, brilliant, yes. Not only that, I mean, you might try it sometime. Walk down the street and find somebody like 20 yards in front of you and walk and follow their walk. Not just follow, but actually make the same movements as them. Even the head movement, the way that the way the shoulders move, the hands move, the hips. Do you see what I mean? Then you actually are walking in their footsteps, because, as a wise man once said, alter your stride and meet a stranger, which moots the question, do we really know ourselves, and do we really know anything? But let's not quite go that far.
That would be a whole nother philosophical podcast where you and I could go on for hours about that.
Yeah, no, we could, couldn't we?
Definitely.
So, I mean, there's one thing about my novel, The Old Dragon's Head, it's called. And we in England we have this thing where, I mean, it's very, very sort of prejudiced. A person's mother-in-law is often referred to as an old dragon, right? And if you're married, and of course, it's very prejudicial and nasty. So the point I'm trying to make is that people might see that title, The Old Dragon's Head, and they think it's to do with fantasy, because certainly the cover is suggestive of it. I don't know if I can hold it up. And, it's got a sort of a slightly fantastical side to it. And that points to a person's assumptions about what they're looking at. Okay. But actually, the old dragon was supposedly something that lived inside in a kind of numinous or supernatural way, lived inside the Great Wall of China. The Chinese believed it would come and protect them from the nasty Mongols in the north, if ever they were attacked. And so the old Dragon's Head is where the Great Wall meets the sea for the only time, on the far eastern end of the Great Wall. So that's the head of the old dragon. So it's not what people think. And just in that whole little drama, you've got, the assumption. I call it the A&E. I don't know if you have the same phrase in America, but the A&E in England is accident and emergency. It's where you go if you have a car accident or something, or you don't feel very well and the doctor's not around. You go to the A&E department. But A&E, in another way, is assumptions and expectations, right? Because they can also land you in a big load of trouble because they lead you down a path. Do you see what I'm saying, don't you?
Right.
Which just is not real, is not true. It's just a surrogacy. Do you understand the word surrogacy? It's like a substitute, leads you down a substitute. You get a substitute reality, if you like. So a little bit about the book there.
I like that. I actually really like that a lot because judging from like the cover, right? It's everything. A&D, that makes perfect sense.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah, so
you wouldn't know until you'd open the book.
There's a phrase, what is it? Mind your P's and Q's. Have you ever heard that phrase?
I have, actually.
Do you know what P's and Q's stands for?
I can't say I remember.
I don't think anybody knows, but I'm going to tell you. It means pleadings and questionings. Comes from Egypt. So A&E is like, better mind your A&E, mind your assumptions and expectations. But they're difficult to spot, aren't they? Because they sort of get at you through the semi-conscious. Often you're not conscious that that's where your mental arrangement is taking you that day, I suppose.
Definitely. And Justin, kind of going off of the covers here and bringing up the dragon's head, I've noticed that you have the same cover artist for all of the books, or I'm assuming it's an A&E.
It is, yeah, it is. His name is Jim Burns. He doesn't live too far from me. I live in the West Country near Bristol in England, and he lives maybe 20, 30 miles away. He's done a lot of fantasy cover art work. You can find them online. It's spectacular artwork. And he draws women. You can tell that he adores women because the way he draws girls and women is just so lovely. But that's an aside. So yes, he has done all four covers, and it gives the book me a little bit of a brand. As people see, they're similar books. And what I say to folks is, yeah, the cover art is the same, and the themes are similar because they cover things like coming of age, not only of people, but of the nations in which they live. So, the old Dragon's Head has got a whole journey for a young man called Bolin, who works on the Great Wall and has some visions of things that have happened on the wall. And it's set in 1400 at this far eastern end of the Great Wall of China. And he doesn't know what the visions mean. So he goes to see the local abbot. And in those days, I looked up how they did exorcisms. So he has this exorcism, but the trouble is it doesn't work. He still has the visions. So he has to go and see Luli. Luli is the local seer, the local clairvoyant. And I don't know if you ever heard the phrase yin-yang eyes. It's what the Chinese call a clairvoyant. They have yin-yang eyes. It's a lovely phrase, isn't it? Yeah. And then she explains a whole different meaning to these visions. And if we've got time, I'll tell you a bit about the shop that she runs.
Oh, absolutely.
She runs something called the Poe Office. Now in England we have post offices where you go and post your letters. Okay, so I like this play on words, this pun, and they called it a Poe Office. Now Poe in Chinese is the name for a soul. Okay, so this Poe Office that's run by this lady. I don't know if you ever heard of something called the transmigration of souls.
I can't say I have.
It's a Buddhist concept. You probably have, but maybe under a different name. It's how they find the Dalai Lama. When the Dalai Lama dies, they believe that his soul flies and enters the body of someone about to be born in the locale. Therefore, the person whose soul it goes to inherits some of the character and personality and history of the person it's come from. Okay. In other words, where the Dalai Lama is concerned, they've inherited how to be a Dalai Lama. That's just why they're looking for him. So it takes them a few years to find it. You look it up, that's how they do it. And that's called a Buddhist idea, called the transmigration of souls. When you came onto this talk, you didn't think you'd be talking about Buddhism, did you? The transmigration of souls. But there you go. It's in the book. So anyway, this lady runs this office because I had this idea, wouldn't it be great if somebody ran a system or method whereby the person who had died left some means for the person who'd inherited their soul to find out who it was.
Interesting.
Okay. So that's her office that she's running, called a Poe Office. So I'm not going to tell you any more. There's a few spoilers in there, but it doesn't spoil the plot at all. But I just love telling that story because it's so, hey, who knows? Who knows? What's the soul? Where does it come from? What do they mean? Does that happen? Do we know? Does the Federal Bureau of Investigation know? I don't. Are they interested? Probably not. Anyway, I better not get facetious.
I love that concept, to be honest, and I love the play on words too. So
yeah, it's great, isn't it?
I feel that if anybody hasn't read any of your stories yet, that's a good kind of intro to be like, hey, definitely go check this stuff out.
Yeah, and you see, that's what, in the end, Narry, I write these books for me. First of all, like I said, I'm the first reader of the writing. I'm trying to work all this stuff out for myself. Mostly where history is concerned. It's all very interesting on its own, but in the end, it's, it's really not an end in itself. The only reason I think to look at history is to understand today. And so that's why I've gone back to what I think are turning moments or moments in history which still influence us today, like the Industrial Revolution. So you might ask me, why did I write about China in the 1400s? Would you like to know?
Why did you write about China in the 1400s, Justin?
Okay. In the 1300s, China was invaded by the Mongols, Genghis Khan and his crew. I mean, that probably seems a long way away for you. But actually, the Chinese, the Mongols rather, they defeated China. I mean, these are basically a bunch of shepherds, right? Get this context. They're a bunch of shepherds. They've never done anything in history before or since. Suddenly, a leader arises amongst them, and he defeats a flailing Chinese dynasty. He defeats an Indian dynasty, which is also flailing and failing, and out of the ashes of it comes the Mughal Empire, and gives us such beautiful architecture as the Taj Mahal, right? They then destroy another flailing civilization around Arabia, and do us a favor by killing the first assassins in history, right? They then get as far as Hungary. Now, Hungary probably seems like a long way away to you. It's just around the corner, right? You know, it's just beyond the local supermarket here. Okay, I exaggerate, but you know what I mean. It's not very far, and it's in the middle of Europe.
Okay.
They only stopped there because the Khan or the king died, and they had to go back and have a powwow to decide on the next one. You know, a lot of Europeans, and probably a lot of Americans, to this day have probably got some Mongol genes in them. Do you get my point?
Yeah.
So, because the Chinese believed in karma, do you understand the idea of karma?
Yep.
Yep. They thought because they'd been invaded, they must have been living wrong. Otherwise, they wouldn't have invited the invasion. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So they're trying to find a new way of living. Makes sense. So in the late 1300s, 1400, they are trying to find a rebirth. Now, it just so happens that in Europe, in 1400, there was another movement which was called the Renaissance. And do you know what Renaissance means?
The Renaissance, it was like they had passed like the Enlightenment and everything, and they had basically come out with like the new movement of arts and the way of living and things like that.
And it means rebirth. So you think to yourself, well, something's going on in world history in 1400, because pretty much nothing had happened since the end of the Roman Empire, world history terms.
Mm-hmm.
So you can almost see, I mean, my conception is that the Mongols did everybody a favor, because, you know, like you get a really strong wind around autumn time, and all the dead boughs on the trees fall off, right? Leaving what's left to survive what's coming and stronger for it. That, I think, was the effect that the Mongols had in world history. Do you get me?
Definitely.
They blew away the rubbish, basically. Because what was left was able to, you know, there really was, in those, you know, the Indian, Chinese, Arabian, Ottoman empires all grew out of the embers they left behind. Quite extraordinary. And then they went home, and then they're forgotten about. What happens with the Mongols today? They've gone back to farming their sheep. Absolutely extraordinary. Completely misunderstood, I think. Well, I don't really understand what happened, but that's my conjecture. So that's why I chose 1400, because I think that was the seeds of the modern world, when the path was cleared, if you like, for something to arise to the point that we have ended up at today. And you and me talking over this kind of technology.
Definitely.
So there you go. We're up to date.
As you would say, Justin, a turning point, and dare I say, probably one of the most important turning points in history, if anything.
Yeah, certainly a very interesting time in those times in the 1400s, when something stirred. It seems something stirred.
Justin, you've answered all of my questions very elegantly during this interview.
Okay. You got
No,
no
and
more questions?
That was pretty much all the questions I had for you. So it wasn't a whole lot,
Yeah.
but we definitely had some really, really great answers. And I really appreciate you going so in depth, especially with a lot of the history and some of the culture, things like that. Where can some of our listeners find your work? Where are your books found? And then do you have anything on social media that they can follow?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the books are available in your stores on Amazon. I think they're on Barnes and Noble and so many other US and Canadian sites. They're available on Kindle or on paperback. There's no audio version yet, maybe one day. They can find me on my website, JUSTINNEWLAND.com, where there's more information about the books, reviews of the books. There's links to the social media, Facebook pages and things like that. Other interviews that I've done, like this with other with libraries, other interested interviewees. Yeah, it's always good fun, isn't it, to talk to
Absolutely.
different people, especially in this case on the other side of the world. So thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure chatting with you today, Justin.
Justin, thank you so much for joining us today. And before we go, is there anything you'd like to say to our listeners?
I'm Justin Newland, and you're listening to the JeanBookNerd podcast.